everyone, and welcome back to our first episode of our podcast, Scraps.
Today we're going to be talking about food waste. As we explained in our introduction, we want to share with everyone some of the things that we have learned in our schooling and how we have changed our consumer habits to align better with our morals. We've decided to focus today on food waste, well, for many reasons. But here are a couple facts just to kind of give you an understanding as to why this subject is very important.
Well, to start things off, wasting something that is essential to our life is kind of ridiculous, if you think about it.
Super ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. Canadians alone waste 2.2 million tons of edible food each year. That's worth $1.7 billion each year. That's like throwing away $4.5 million every day.
And what's even crazier is that in 2016, 815 million people were undernourished and didn't have access to enough food.
So we just waste a bunch of food, and then there's also a bunch of people that are not able to get the necessary nutrients. It just doesn't make sense. Another big factor is that it contributes to 8% of global emissions.
And if we continue to waste at the rate that we do, 27 to 45 gigatons of carbon will be produced by 2050. That's in like 30 years, people.
We cannot produce that many gigatons. There's not the space to do it. I think it's also important to recognize that developed countries are the biggest contributors to food waste. So, as Canadians, we have the moral and ethical responsibility to be more aware of our consumer habits. So, I think one of the reasons we picked food waste to talk about as a subject is, for me at least, I am a huge foodie. I love food, and it's infuriating that it's just getting thrown away. Believe it or not, 35% of the food we buy is thrown out. If you think about it, that's like 1/3 of the groceries.
And that's huge. Like, I never even thought about it, but like that's a lot of food that I buy.
Yeah, like you wouldn't think that 1/3 of your food is getting thrown out, but you know, if you don't think about that apple that wasn't that good, that you maybe ate half of, or those strawberries that you left in the back of the fridge and just started molding, and
Strawberries always get me.
Yeah, you gotta eat them right away. But it's just, we should try not to do that. Yeah. It's not good. So why is food wasted? I think if you're like me, you know, if you love food, you don't want to see it go to waste.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I don't think anybody wants to waste food, but I think it's become something that's so mindless. Like, where food is so available to us, like, we have such good access to it here, like, specifically in Canada.
Yeah, like, we have disposable income, for the most part, for Canadians, that allows people to buy stuff without really considering whether they need it or not.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a study that shows that 39% of participants in the study were not aware of food waste issues. So it's almost 40%.
Yeah, and I feel like that's so true. When I talk to my friends about food waste, they're like, "What, food waste? Like, I'm eating my food," but it's like, well, you're not though. Are you?
Yeah.
Are you eating it all?
Are you really eating your food?
Are you?
You're only eating 1/3 of it or 2/3 of it? I don't know. People are very disconnected from their food. We now rely on labels and government policies to determine the quality of our food. We have a very limited understanding of food labeling and often misinterpret what they mean, resulting in a high level of food waste.
I think it's also important to note that food waste doesn't just happen on the consumer level. It happens on all levels of food production. We're focusing mostly on consumer waste because that's kind of where we have the most power to make the change, and we can change our ways easier than obviously changing. Yeah,
Stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have the power to change the way that we move. So let's start with that, step one.
Exactly.
And go from there.
Yeah. So Lillian, tell me why. Why should I reduce my food waste?
Well, as we mentioned, it contributes to 8% of global emissions. So you might think, okay, whoa, there's no way that like throwing out a small portion of my dinner is going to contribute to 8% of global emissions. But something you don't consider when you're buying your produce is all the energy that goes into creating and manufacturing that food to get from the ground all the way to your plate. I mean, think of all the energies required to make that delicious cup of coffee.
So we're not only wasting the food itself, but we're also wasting the energy that that particular product needed in order to get to your plate. So for instance, when we waste food, 24% of the fresh water used to produce that product is wasted. It's gone. As well as like 23% of the fertilizers and 23% of the cropland.
Just all that energy, right out the window. Isn't that nuts? And that's only some of the energies that are wasted. If you think about it, there's so many parts along the supply chain of this product that are wasted. To name a few, how does the food get there? It's transported there, so all the energy from transporting it.
You have to have it nicely packaged in some plastic or cardboard, and that has to be produced in a factory.
There's also storing it, keeping it cold in grocery stores. All the employment fees for people harvesting and servicing that food.
And them driving to their job.
All that energy.
And CO2 emissions.
Greenhouse gases.
It's all in the air
now.
So now we've kind of talked about how food's being wasted, but how should we deal with that? What should we do?
I think it's important to note, I personally consider myself very aware of food waste, but I still catch myself wasting food. You know, if you forget something in the fridge or just, you know, you have the ethical dilemma, do I get a doggy bag and take my food home and use a plastic container, or do I waste the food?
And I think it's important to remember that everybody makes mistakes at times. You're not going to be perfect throughout this whole journey to wasting less food.
From when I started learning about food waste to now, I definitely waste a lot less. So I think step one would be become aware of food waste and how much waste you're producing and how much waste people around you are producing.
Because as soon as you are aware of it, then you realize, oh my gosh, I just threw that out. I could have eaten that. Or I let this rot in my fridge and I shouldn't have. And that being aware of that is what's important.
Yeah, you know, you're stuck now. You can't go back. You've listened to the podcast, or at least 2 minutes into it, and you know all the problems. So it's going to weigh heavy on your conscience now. So step one, check. You are officially aware.
You're knowledgeable in the food waste sector.
So the next step is to start planning. Start to get yourself organized to what kind of food you need for the week.
Yeah. That was one of the first steps I took in reducing my food waste, was when you go to the grocery store, make a list. Don't just go in thinking, I think I want pasta this week and maybe some burgers. Go in with Monday I'm having this, Tuesday I'm having this, and what do I need for those meals? And that's exactly what I started doing. And it's actually crazy how much less food I started wasting. I was like using every bit of my food and then on Sunday, my shelf was completely empty. And I was ready to go to the store again with my new list and my new menu.
Yeah, I think that's also a really good way of getting diversity in your meals. So in the end, it's healthier for you as well.
Yeah.
A 2-in-1 deal there. Health and food waste reduction. Another way that you can reduce your food waste as a consumer is to not trust the labels. Often, the best before dates, they're mostly there for guidelines. I mean, there's certain foods that you can't consume. I would be cautious with meats and
some dairies.
Some dairies. I mean, if there's not chunks coming out of your milk jug, then I don't think you have to worry about it too much. Mm-hmm. They're generally there just for a guideline. Best before dates are created under the assumption that the food is going to go through the worst possible conditions before getting to your plate. So it's more of a form to cover their butts so they don't get sued. But for the most part, you should just use your natural human instincts and smell the food. You'll know if it smells bad. And just look if you see mold.
And if you're a little skeptical, just give it a tiny little taste, and I'm sure it'll taste a little funny, and then you throw it out.
Yeah.
My boyfriend is a strong believer in the best before dates. He's like, this is going bad tonight. I'm like, no, it's not going bad. It's suggested to possibly eat before then, but if it doesn't look bad, it doesn't smell bad, and doesn't have a nasty taste, I'm sure your apple pie is going to be fine.
Yeah, and like as apple pie is an example, it says that's like if you consume it before this date, you'll experience the best quality of this food. It's not as soon as it turns 12:01, this food will kill you.
Yeah, it's just not going to be as fresh. Like you just use your sniffer, use your eyes. It's all good.
It'll be okay.
Yeah. But anyways, another thing to consider when trying to reduce your food waste is portion control. Oftentimes, our eyes are a lot bigger than our stomachs, and we load on those mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving, and we don't eat them all. But a fun fact to do with portion control is our plate sizes have actually grown in 36% since the 1960s. So our plates are getting bigger, which then forces us to kind of put more food on our plate, you know?
Yeah, when we have the space to put food on our plates, we're most likely going to do it. Especially if it tastes good.
Absolutely.
I'm a victim to that. There's an interesting study done at a university where they removed the food trays from the cafeteria, so students were only allowed to have one plate, and big plate. It's not like people are suffering, but it just made them put only what they needed on the plate. That reduced food waste by a lot, just because people weren't taking food they didn't need. And if they wanted more, they could just go back for seconds. So it's better to take less and then add some than waste food later.
Exactly. Another thing to kind of go along with portions is, as someone that cooks for themselves, I'm really bad at cooking for a single person. But instead of just letting that sit in my fridge and kind of go bad, I portion it up into separate meals and I freeze it. And then if I'm busy one day and I just need a quick meal, throw it out of the freezer, take it out of the freezer, throw it in the microwave. There's a meal right there, and nothing's gone to waste. And it's a super simple idea, but a lot of people forget about that.
One thing that I've done recently that has been I've gotten quite a joy from is I've been saving all my veggie scraps. So like tips of garlic, the ends of my carrots. If I peel my vegetables, I put it all in a big container and freeze it. And then when I get enough of them, I just boil a big pot, and then I get a fresh veggie broth. You could do a Google search to get some more information, but this is a really fun way of reducing, this isn't necessarily food waste, but it's a good way of reducing waste from our food products and getting the most out of our resources. So we have all these reasons as to why and how to reduce food waste. And it seems pretty obvious why we should reduce it. But why is it still happening since, it shouldn't? I think it's also important to recognize in addressing why it occurs is that food waste happens on many levels. So we're talking mostly today about food waste on a consumer level, but there are insane quantities of food that are wasted during manufacturing, production, and so on. So I think one of the reasons that people don't reduce their food waste is because it doesn't seem like an economically viable option. An argument I would say against that is, in reality, when you're reducing your food waste, you'll most likely be saving a lot of money in the bigger picture, as I had mentioned before.
Yeah, and I think it's like initially it's going to be difficult to be waste free because it does take organization and a lot of thought has to be put into it. But when you take the steps to put the thought in it to organize yourself, you will eventually start saving money because you're not throwing your food away.
Yeah. So overall, reducing food waste can have major impacts on our environment. We can reduce hunger, we can reduce our greenhouse gases. It's just overall really good. We improve our consumer awareness. So I'm hoping that through this podcast, you may have learned a couple tips and tricks from us and the way that we live our lifestyles, a couple mistakes that maybe we've made, and hopefully you can grow with us in trying to reduce our food waste.
So thank you for listening, and join us next week when we are talking about plant-rich diets.
This is Scraps.